Who's your favorite Beatle and why is it George the correct answer? Okay, this is the part where it's supposed to go ba-ba-da. Detective Ducky. Hello, my ducklings, and welcome to another episode of Detective Ducky, your local iceberg detective. Today, we are moving on from a little bit of a more obscure iceberg to the Beatles iceberg. I'm sure all my iceberg enjoyers know what's going on, but this format basically describes facts about a specific topic, in this case, the Beatles, with more tertiary information, if you will, at the top, a little more basic knowledge, and at the bottom is the dark abyss where all the very obscure facts lie. I have been a huge Beatles fan since middle school, and as you can see, joining me back here in this lovely police lineup of cringe are the stuffed animals of the Beatles I got for Christmas when I was 12. I was just telling my sister how I've somehow never kissed these things, not even once. Let's jump right into tier 1. Fact number 1, we are starting off with Yellow Submarine, which is one of the Beatles' weirdly many films. And this is the only animated one that I know of. There's also the Beatles, the animated series, and that was even more chaotic. It was released in 1960, and it starred exactly none of the Beatles as voice actors. They do, however, appear at the end of the movie, which made me think that they were in it, but no, it was actually all voice impersonators, and they all do a great job. And it's a very trippy movie, a very weird movie, very loose plot, but it became a cult classic due to the very unique animation, the beautiful colors, and the general weirdness. And also it has songs like Hey Bulldog, which eventually became like huge Beatles classics and one of my very favorites. The soundtrack included 4 original songs, 2 pre-made songs that already existed. And this is counted as an album in and of itself, and the reception was like, not great. The orchestra recordings were like praised, but the songs themselves had sort of mixed reception. Specifically, All Together Now got really hated on for no reason. I think it's wonderful and it's really cute. It's one of my favorites. Generally, it was mostly B-sides, like kind of B-tier, C-tier songs, but they're still amazing because it's the Beatles. Number 2, the Shea Stadium concert. Do the Mets play at Shea Stadium? Editing Ducky, can you please tell me if they do? Because my boyfriend loves the Mets. So the Shea Stadium concert was very important in Beatles history and in general music history because it was record-breaking in attendance and sort of started the whole stadium concert thing. It was sort of an icon of Beatlemania. This is where we get a lot of the images of girls being like, oh my gosh! You can see them screaming, crying, falling over. There were roughly 55,000 people there, and it is considered one of the most legendary concerts in the Beatles history. Also, if you look at pictures of the Beatles in this concert, they look straight up green. They look very unwell. I think it's the lighting, but also they're sweating their butts off. And also security had to be very strong because people kept trying to storm the stage, which I'm sure is not at all indicative of things to come. Am I right, ladies? Hey Jude was about Julian Lennon, that is. Yes, the song Hey Jude was written for John's son, Julian Lennon. John Lennon left his first wife, Cynthia, in 1968, leaving Julian very sad, given that he was pretty much abandoned by his father. And also, his father then proceeded to have another child and write a song about him called Beautiful Boy. So that's a little bit of like a oof, that must have hurt pretty bad. And John didn't even write the song. Paul wrote the song to comfort Julian and basically to remind him to have a positive outlook on it all. And according to Julian, it was a very appreciated gesture by his essentially pseudo-uncle, but hearing it so often after it became a hit was just a constant reminder of the fact that his parents did in fact split up. So just sad vibes all around. Beatlemania and the British invasion. Oh yeah, this is what a first tier is for. Broad definitions. Beatlemania was the phenomenon of like extreme fan worship and hysteria around the Beatles. They were constantly met with screams wherever they went. They were chased down the street, and fans would scramble to take like any morsel of the Beatles they could, including their hair, pieces of their clothes. Even they had barbers who would take the hair that they cut from their haircuts and sell it to people. Like, it was bad. And sort of this hysteria was able to happen because of the Beatles' approach to writing songs. They were writing these love songs that were essentially directed right at their audience, like P.S. I love you. So this was basically, they were creating a parasocial relationship before people even knew what that was. And so people were like they love me, they just don't know it yet. Like, you know, they want to be like YN and be like in the crowd at a concert reading a book, and then they're like, you, like, you know what I mean? Like, they wanted to have their little fan fiction moment. And I can definitely confirm that this phenomenon is alive, because when I was younger, I had a crazy crush on George Harrison, and every night I would wish that he wasn't dead anymore so we could go on a date. I hate my digital footprint. I hate my digital footprint. The British invasion was another phenomenon that corresponded with the rise of Beatlemania, and they were a huge reason for it. Many other British Merseybeat bands and facets of British culture, such as fashion, language, ideas, became more popular among American audiences. Among these groups were the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Zombies, the Animals, Herman's Hermits, who I saw in concert, Love You Peter Noon, the Who, and many, many more. From one iconic concert to another, we have the Rooftop Concert. The Rooftop Concert occurred on January 30th of 1969 on the roof of the Apple Corporation building, which is a company the Beatles had. I'm sure we're going to get into that later, on Savile Road in London. They played for 42 minutes before being asked by authorities to be quieter. They played Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, The One After 909, and Dig a Pony. They played some of the songs more than once, actually, because this was like their jam band era. The show went great, which was very impressive because it was only put together in a couple days. Many takes of the song from this show were put on subsequent albums. Eventually, the entire concert's audio was released by itself. You can also see the concert in its entirety in the Beatles documentary on Disney+, which I was not able to finish because I was so overwhelmed, because I'm such a big Beatles fan that seeing them walk and talk and be people when I've normally only seen them in photos actually overwhelmed me to the point of near tears. So I'm still getting on that. Okay, now we're getting somewhere a little interesting. Members of the Order of the British Empire. Now, what the frick heck does this mean? The most excellent order of the British Empire is filled with people whose contributions to music and art are considered so significant and valuable that they should be awarded special status. Being part of the MBE is a very high honor that all the Beatles were given in 1965. As we all know, Paul and Ringo were also later knighted. George was offered to be in the MBE, but he actually declined because he was upset about not also being knighted. John Lennon also rejected being part of the MBE because he disagreed with a lot of the political actions of England at the time. When John Lennon got this letter from the UK, he thought he was being drafted for military service. And when he realized that he wasn't, he just chucked it right in with the rest of his mail, not especially keen on getting that award. And fun fact, a lot of other MBE members actually turned in their medals because they were just super mad the Beatles got in because they thought that it undermined the legitimacy of the organization. In response to those people, John Lennon was quoted as saying, "Lots of people who complained about us getting the MBE received theirs for heroism in the war. They got theirs for killing people. We got ours for entertaining. I'd say we deserve ours more." John Lennon is always very brave and very brazen in his public statements, my goodness. But somehow, I'm actually not sure, but John Lennon did end up getting an MBE. They all did. And then John actually gave it to his Aunt Mimi, who was his caretaker when he was a child, and he was just like, "Girly pop, you deserve this more than me," which I think is really sweet. Also, Paul and George would later wear their medals on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And apparently John Lennon regretted giving his medal away. Like, I'm getting whiplash right now. The Ed Sullivan Show, our old friend. So Ed Sullivan scouted the Beatles in London, seeing promise and the way that they were really able to whip up a crowd, put on a solid show, and create lots of excitement. I Want to Hold Your Hand was already released before their public appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. A month before their appearance, it was already a monstrous hit. The broadcast was watched by 73 million people, which was, of course, a record at the time. Uh-oh. We're at the bigger than Jesus part. So when I first made this video a couple years ago, I hadn't come back to the faith yet. And I was like, what's the big deal? Who cares? Why was everyone overreacting? And while I do think that people did things that were not proper measures or not the proper thing to do, I think that it was a completely justified response because, oh my gosh, like I think people are like, what? John Lennon just said the Beatles are bigger than Jesus. That's not like a big deal, which like very disrespectful. Why did you have to bring up Jesus like that? Number 3, that's not where it ends. It just keeps going. So I will read that for you. So getting to it. Bigger than Jesus is a reference to an infamous John Lennon quote that goes as follows. Oh my gosh, it's so long. John Lennon's words, by the way. Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me. That's so bad. What is wrong with this guy? That's so unnecessary. That's literally like the most unnecessary thing ever. It actually kind of makes me upset. Listen, if I were around at this time, I wouldn't burn my records, but I would be like, you know what? I'm not gonna support you guys anymore. Until I got a hashtag apology. But yeah, no, this was really, really uncalled for and out of nowhere. And this caused a really big uproar. So there were protests, record burnings, boycotts of the Beatles, and even, the KKK started picketing at their concerts. See, that's not good. As someone the KKK doesn't like, a Catholic, what the frick is going on? But yeah, no, this was a huge freaking controversy, but the controversy did sort of wane after the release of the Beatles' new album, Revolver. John Lennon eventually gave a public apology. I'm sure he didn't mean it. Their experiences on tour that year as a result of the controversy, as well as their increasingly poor treatment tied to the frenzy of Beatlemania, led to the Beatles deciding to never tour again. And also, again, in a massive, terrible overreaction, John Lennon's assassin credited this controversy as part of the reason why he wanted to kill John Lennon. That's not very Christian of you, Mark David Chapman. Y'all need this. Y'all need this. Y'all need this, bro. The fifth Beatle. Who is it? I have my opinion. Everyone has their opinion. Many people have either been kind of nominated, and it's like, this is the fifth Beatle, but also a lot of people have claimed to be the fifth Beatle. Those who were sort of appointed the position include Stuart Sutcliffe, Pete Best, Brian Epstein, George Martin, and basically, to be considered for being the fifth Beatle, you must have contributed to the band significantly and brought something new to the table that the other Beatles couldn't on their own. That's why it is my personal belief that either George Martin or Brian Epstein should be considered the fifth Beatle. I primarily think George Martin, however, I do think that Brian Epstein's management was a huge reason for their success and the reason why they didn't break up much sooner. The Beatles themselves have also made some suggestions of who the fifth Beatle could be. For instance, Paul McCartney said that it should be Brian Epstein who's considered the fifth Beatle. And George Harrison, in a shocking move, said that their old PR manager, Derek Taylor, should be considered the fifth Beatle. Or Neil Aspinall, who was the road manager and later a business executive. There was also just this random radio personality called Murray the K, who was this random guy, and he called himself the fifth Beatle, I believe because he played their record so much. He's like, I made those boys, and it's like, no you didn't. And I also believe he coined the term fifth Beatle, which is kind of corny if you're calling yourself that, and a little gutsy. Not a fan. Eric Clapton played the guitar solo on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Pretty explanatory title, he did, and this was one of the only times that a non-Beatle played on a Beatles track. And the Beatles were like, what? But yeah, George Harrison insisted, it's my song, my friend's really good at guitar, and he's gonna play the solo. It's an absolutely amazing solo. The Cavern Club is a music club, which was originally a jazz club, where the Beatles had a artist residency, essentially, where they would play every day. And this is where they formed their sound, where they rehearsed so much that they were able to record their first album all in one take, and where they had numerous stories. So there's this extremely interesting Wikipedia article that I will read from you now. This is just a little anecdote. Before the performance, the Quarrymen, which is what the Beatles were called, argued amongst themselves about the set list, as rock and roll songs were definitely not allowed in the club, but skiffle was tolerated. After opening with a skiffle song, John Lennon called for the others to start playing an Elvis Presley song, Don't Be Cruel. Rod Davis warned Lennon that the audience would eat you alive, but Lennon ignored this and started playing the song himself, forcing the others to join in. Halfway through, Sittner pushed his way through the audience and handed Lennon a note that said, "Cut out the bloody rock and roll." Paul McCartney's first appearance at the Cavern with the Quarrymen on 24th of January 1958. Harrison first played during a lunchtime session in the 9th of February 1961. Sittner sold the Cavern Club to Ray McFall in 1959 and moved to London. Blues bands and beat groups began to appear at the club on a regular basis in the 1960s. The first beat night was held on the 25th of May, 1960, and featured a performance by Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, which included Ringo Starr as drummer. We'll talk about them later. By early 1961, Bob Wooler had become the full-time compere, don't know what that is, and organizer of the lunchtime sessions. The club hosted its first performance by the Beatles on February 9th of 1961. Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager who secured the group's first contract, first saw the group perform at the club on November 9th, 1961. Inspired by the group, Epstein made moves to take over their management. So a lot of history there. I did want to paraphrase because it felt like plagiarism. Bob Dylan introduced pop to the Beatles. So in the song I Want to Hold Your Hand, in the middle it goes, I can't hide, I can't hide, I can't hide. But to most people, it sounds like I get high. So Bob Dylan heard this and he's like, yeah, these dudes party. He definitely figured the Beatles had smoked before. So the Beatles and Bob Dylan met for the first time in the Delmonico Hotel. John Lennon corrected him about the lyrics, but Bob Dylan literally just did not care and gave them joints, and they got absolutely obliterated, smoking and drinking. Speaking of drugs, so Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is not about LSD. It's just not. So I understand that that's the acronym, but here's the thing. It's based on a painting by Julian. Look at this. Look how cute it is. It's based on a painting by Julian Lennon, which was a painting, I believe, of a girl from his school, Lucy. So it was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And they took that art, and so they took this painting and used it as inspiration for their song, which I think is very, very cute. Right, Beatles name origin. So technically the name the Beatles is a pun, because we all know that the bug Beatles is spelled with 2 E's. But the Beatles were not only inspired by Buddy Holly's backing band, the Crickets, so they're like, hey, we want a bug name, let's have a bug name. So they got a bug name, but they also wanted to infuse a little bit of a little musician humor, if you will. And so they spelled it like beat, like a beat. So, isn't that hilarious? Wow, that's awesome. Paul is dead theory. My darling Paul is dead theory. So, Paul is dead theory is a theory that Paul McCartney actually died on November 9th in 1966 and was replaced by an exact doppelganger who they found in a look-alike contest, who somehow talks the exact same and looks the exact same and writes the same quality of music. And people call this, us Paul truthers, call this guy either call him William Campbell or Billy Shears. People got this alleged name from the first lyrics to With a Little Help from My Friends, which is the second track on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There was also this, so it's completely untrue, but there's really cool made up evidence for it. Or maybe it's real, I don't know, but not the theory itself, but the evidence maybe. So the theory was that if you took the cover of Magical Mystery Tour and held it up to a mirror, it would supposedly display a phone number. And if you called it, the number was allegedly that of a morgue or a voice saying, keep going, in reference to continuing to find clues about Paul McCartney being so allegedly dead. Some of the rousing evidence that people used was Paul McCartney being barefoot on the cover of Abbey Road. And people also say that the other members' outfits resemble other things. People say that George looks like a gravedigger. John looks like the funeral officiator. Ringo looks like a mourner, these things. People also cite lyrics from songs such as Glass Onion, Strawberry Fields Forever. People say that when you play Glass Onion or Strawberry Fields Forever backwards, you can hear such cryptic lines as, turn me on, dead man. I buried Paul, which a lot of people are like, that's actually cranberry sauce. And it's like, I don't know. There's also the song A Day in the Life, which I think is the most compelling. There's lyrics about a man blowing his mind out in a car because he didn't notice that the lights had changed. Also, this is one of my favorite Beatles moments of all time. It's gorgeous. Notably, in this lyric, it says the onlookers have seen his face before, which implies he's some sort of a celebrity. There's also another piece of alleged evidence on the cover of Abbey Road in this little license plate. It says 28IF, which is supposed to be a reference to the fact that within the year of its release, Paul McCartney would have been 28. But I don't know. They can't put a whole car in there. Are you telling me they custom made a license plate and put the car there in this completely impromptu photo shoot? Like, girl, sure. The last entry in our first tier, Paul's cameo in Pirates of the Caribbean. I remember when the new Pirates of the Caribbean movie came out, I was really excited because I was like, Paul McCartney's in it, oh my gosh, and I was like freaking out. And I remember how old I was, but I was old enough that my hyperfixation was like through the roof. So Johnny Depp is also very involved in music. He had his band called Hollywood Vampires. So Paul McCartney, Johnny Depp, there's a little bit of overlap because of their shared music, and they've known each other for years. Johnny Depp has actually appeared in a couple of Paul McCartney's music videos, and he sort of repaid the kindness by letting him have a role in Pirates of the Caribbean. Paul plays Jack's uncle, who he is reunited with in a jail cell while he is awaiting execution. Jack's uncle's fate in the movie is actually ambiguous, so who knows? Choo, baby! A Day in the Life was originally 2 separate songs created by Paul and John, respectively. As you can tell by listening to it, which I would recommend you should, A Day in the Life has 2 very different segments, which are bridged by orchestral and singing parts by John Lennon and their fabulous orchestra. The first part, detailing a car crash, is major evidence for the Paul is dead conspiracy, as we talked about last time. But this lyric is not very widely, this lyric is allegedly, most likely, about Tara Brown. The 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire, which was a real number taken from a headline, and how the English army won the war, which is an allusion to the film that John Lennon was in 1967 called How I Won the War. The other part stitched in at the end was a completely different Paul McCartney song, which was made into the bridge, where Paul McCartney is basically talking about how he would often start his days when he was younger by basically waking up, falling out of bed, all that. Both songs were created separately, but they just didn't know what to do with them, so they put it together and made like this epic beast of a song. I love this one. That sparks such joy. Ringo narrated 2 seasons of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. He played the character of Mr. Conductor and would frequently appear on screen as well, and he was like super little. It was really funny. Many kids didn't notice this until they got older, and then they're like, oh my gosh, that was Ringo Starr all along. He narrated the first 2 seasons and then also appeared in Shining Time Station, which was another Thomas-affiliated show. He left the series to tour with his all-star band, who I have seen and who are amazing. The Beatles were supposed to dub the vultures in The Jungle Book. So clearly the vultures in The Jungle Book were designed after the Beatles. They have their mop tops, and looking by their haircuts, it's not hard to say who's who. The directors wanted the Beatles to play themselves and sing the song That's What Friends Are For. And the song was allegedly supposed to be more Beatles-like before they realized that the Beatles said no dice. As you can see if you've ever seen The Jungle Book actually has many characters, or at least more than one, who are inspired by real-life musicians such as Louis Prima, which is a little bit of a poorly aged example. Some say it was schedules not lining up, something John Lennon refused, which is something he loved doing. I think that's more likely because the director of the most recent Jungle Book also tried to get Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr again, but they refused, so I think the Beatles just said no to begin with. I'm seeing a real pattern here. This entry is my pride and joy. Jelly babies / jelly beans. There is a difference and it will matter. So George Harrison was allegedly a huge fan of the UK candy Jelly Babies, calling them his favorite treat. He also claimed that John Lennon would frequently steal his Jelly Babies. This was such a mundane comment, I believe on the radio, but Beatles fans just took it and ran. They started throwing Jelly Babies on stage during their UK concerts. They sent the Beatles overwhelming amounts of Jelly Babies in the mail. To the point, the Beatles literally hated this, and George Harrison had to write a letter to these people saying, quote, "We don't like Jelly Babies, or fruit gums for that matter, so think how we feel standing on stage trying to dodge the stuff before you throw some more at us. Besides, it is dangerous. I was hit in the eye once with a boiled sweet and it's not funny." Now this was extremely annoying, but it would only get worse when they went to the US. You see, the US doesn't have Jelly Babies. They have jelly beans. And jelly beans, fun fact, are a lot harder than Jelly Babies. Another quote from George Harrison. "That night, we were absolutely pelted by the effing things. They don't have soft jelly beans. They don't have soft jelly babies here. They have hard jelly beans. To make matters worse, we were on a circular stage, so they were hitting us from all sides. Imagine waves of rock-hard little bullets raining down on you from the sky. If jelly beans travel around 50 miles an hour through the air, hit you in the eye, you're finished. You're blind, aren't you? We've never liked people throwing stuff like that. We don't mind them throwing streamers, but jelly beans are a bit dangerous, you see. Every now and again, one would hit a string of my guitar and plonk off a bad note as I was trying to play. Oh my gosh! Reportedly, one concert in the US needed to be stopped twice. Because the jelly bean problem was just out of control. The attacks thankfully eventually petered out and it was no longer an issue. But this is only the second weirdest thing that would happen due to a Beatles' public remarks. Get Back, Let It Be orchestral dub, and Let It Be naked. Let It Be, the Beatles' final released album, had a previous working title of Get Back, since Get Back was the leading single. The Beatles listened to the first pressings of Get Back and didn't like them, and just pushed them to the wayside. Then they began working on Abbey Road. After this, the band was already beginning to split, with John leaving the band. This means the final song to complete the album, I Me Mine, was recorded with only 3 of the Beatles. This album was their final one, and it was released under the name Let It Be. The original was produced by George Martin. It was released in tandem with a documentary film of the same name, came out in 1970. Phil Spector was essentially asked to compile the rest of the album from all of these recordings that were laying around. This made a very mismatched sound. Paul McCartney was not very happy at Phil's additions, which involved very over-the-top orchestral parts that sort of bordered on being obnoxious and manipulative. This made Paul McCartney very angry, feeling like his work was made into something that it was never intended to be. Because George Martin was a lot more collaborative, Phil Spector was more, this is my way, this is the Phil Spector show, let's do this. So he worked along the producers Paul Hitt, Guy Massey, and Alan Roos to create Let It Be Naked, which was a stripped-down album, capturing the intended feeling of hearing a live jam band. I think the style gives Let It Be a great amount of charm, with the band falling apart, with members not being able to record together. The album was certainly working against the odds from the start. The Beatles went to Germany. I don't know why it says went to Germany. That's a massive understatement. The Beatles did not just go to Germany. They rocked Germany. Early in their career, the Beatles played in the Indra Club in Hamburg, Germany for 48 nights, from August to October of 1960. They had a residency there, sleeping at the venue in the Bambi Kino, which was a cinema nearby. And they said that they could smell the toilets all the time. At that point, the Beatles lineup was John Lennon, George Harrison, Stuart Sutcliffe, their bassist, Pete Best, their drummer, and Paul McCartney, of course. During this residency, George was actually deported from Germany for playing at this Indra Club while he was actually underage. Paul McCartney and Pete Best were later arrested and also deported for setting a condom on fire on the side of a building, which almost resulted in a fire, so it was considered arson. But before then, they were playing and getting paid $30 a night, playing 7 hours a day. The length of the gigs also meant that the Beatles had to be rapidly creating new content in order to populate the amount of time. They had to stretch out their songs with improvisation and jams, and that helped them massively build up their skill. They became such a tight live band. While in Germany, they were also able to secure Ringo Starr as their drummer, who was in Germany with his band Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. This is also where the Beatles would get their signature haircuts, so that was certainly an eventful time for them. Moving on to Stu Sutcliffe, who has a very special place in my heart. Stuart Ferguson Victor Sutcliffe was the Beatles' original bassist. Additionally, he was a painter, and I'll give you some examples of his art here. I think it's very, very interesting. Along with John, Stu was also very influential in naming the band. He played with the Beatles in Hamburg, where he would meet his girlfriend Astrid Kircher, who would eventually give the Beatles their signature haircuts. After playing with the band for about a year, Stuart Sutcliffe left to focus more on his painting, and he enrolled in art school. Tragically, in 1962, Stuart Sutcliffe would suddenly die of a brain hemorrhage. He had extreme headaches and had a tendency to pass out during art class. He experienced these sorts of head pains on April 10th of 1962 and fainted once again and died on his way to the hospital. He was integral to the Beatles' history and was a wonderful player, artist, and person while he was alive. Pete Best, baby. Born Randolph Peter Best, was the original drummer for the Beatles and is sadly most known for missing out the huge opportunity of being the Beatles' drummer to Ringo Starr. His mother owned a coffee club where the Quarrymen, who would eventually become the Beatles, would play quite often, and they eventually asked him to join their band. They asked him to join the band in 1960. He was fired and replaced with Ringo Starr by Brian Epstein, though all the Beatles had some part in requesting a replacement. But before that, he played on many tracks which would eventually find their way to the Beatles anthology series, such as the recorded audition for Decca Records. During the recordings, George Martin just didn't like how Pete Best sounded, thinking the rest of the band could use some more support. He started hiring session musicians for the studio while letting Best play live. Pete Best would later start a band on his own and release an album called Best of the Beatles, which people bought, obviously thinking that it was a Best of the Beatles compilation, only to find out it was just a bunch of Pete Best songs, which no one wanted. But technically, he can't get in trouble because he is Pete Best of the Beatles. Girl. I mean, he's not wrong. The Beatles met Elvis. Pretty self-explanatory, but the Beatles met Elvis at his home, and I think the most, it's very interesting because not only is this a historic moment, because it's sort of the old meeting the new, and sort of Elvis meeting his replacements, and they got to meet their idol, but what I find the most interesting is that John Lennon did a Hitler impression in front of Elvis. That will always be true. So the Beatles met Elvis, yeah. Brian Epstein's death led to the Beatles breaking up. This is a widely held belief. Brian Epstein was the Beatles manager since they first started out and was loyal to them and kept them in check for years. However, sadly, in August of 1967, Brian Epstein would pass away from an overdose on sleeping pills. Apparently accidental. This was an intense personal blow to the band, of course. And he had managed to keep the four of them in check by being an objective observer, because there would be a big clash of egos, and he was there to sort of mitigate that. With a new lack of checks and balances, Paul McCartney became the primary Beatle, and he had the most creative control over their music. John Lennon was incredibly angered by this, and George and Ringo were mostly ignored. You know, not that they were ever prioritized in the first place. Paul McCartney's father-in-law offered to be their manager, but they refused. Instead, they hired Alan Klein. Klein proceeded to fire the entirety of the staff of the Beatles' Apple Corporation, which was definitely questionable. Klein also later sued the Beatles for $19 million, so that's not great. I believe that since Brian Epstein was from the beginning, he didn't really have ulterior motives, but when all of a sudden there is a vacuum of this position at the height of the Beatles' popularity, there are going to be people who are... But anyway, about the breakup. They were already facing so much pressure, being the most famous people in the whole dang world. They had a company that had so many confusing working parts that I can make a whole video about it. They recorded this whole album and basically had to scrap it for the longest time. And on top of it, their manager, who actually cared about them and was a personal friend, had died. With Brian gone, they were facing managers who didn't care about them at all. They were dealing with squabbles between bandmates and members literally leaving. It may not have been the sole cause, but Brian Epstein's death absolutely contributed to the Beatles' downfall. On a lighter note, but not much, a dentist introduced LSD to George and John. A George and John solo adventure. This is new. So Dr. John Riley, I don't know if there's a picture or anything, but this fella invited George and John to have dinner at his house. A very prominent dentist, by the way. I don't know if there's any famous dentists out there. So they invited John Lennon and George Harrison, along with their wives, to dinner. Before they left, he gave them both cups of coffee, telling them to drink it all. In that coffee, he secretly put LSD. They were obviously extremely upset, as anyone should be. They got drugged. This was their first introduction with the drug, and I can only imagine it was absolutely terrifying. It's tier 3, gang. I'm so excited. George Harrison went to the USA before the Beatles got famous. In 1963, while the other Beatles were on various vacations to various other European countries, George Harrison flew to America with his brother to see his older sister, Louise. Their adventures took them to a record store, where George bought a pressing of the song I Got My Mind Set on You, which we all know he would later record a cover version of himself. I found out this was a cover when I was researching for the video. I'm like, what? He didn't write that? While also there, he picked up a copy of She Loves You, which had just been released in America. I think this is honestly just a very wholesome entry. Great palate cleanser. Rory, Storm, and the Hurricanes. Now, Rory, Storm, and the Hurricanes were Beatles contemporaries, and they were just as, if not more popular at times, although they are obviously now largely forgotten except for the Beatles community, who think that they are whimsical and cute and write about them in fan fictions. Tell me I'm wrong. Storm and the Hurricanes was the band that Ringo Starr was in before the Beatles. They only recorded and released 2 singles. Their legacy remains as purely a live band. Brian Epstein produced their first single, America. They were originally called Dracula and the Vampires, and then Al Caldwell's Texans. I love these quirky men. I love them. Rory's real name was actually Alan Caldwell. He opened a skiffle club that hosted the Hurricanes and the Quarrymen, the Proto-Beatles. And this was the place where George Harrison first auditioned for the Beatles. Ringo Starr played for the Hurricanes for the first time in 1959. They entered a Search for the Stars competition and finished second. They played at the Cavern Club in 1960, but were booed for playing rock and roll and pelted with coins by the audience. They were fined for their performance because it was a little too rowdy, but the coins thrown at them allegedly satisfied the fine. Ringo, who was previously known as Richie, developed a slot in their presentation called Star Time, where he got a solo. Don't know if that was the origin of his nickname. Also, his last name's Starkey, so it was like shortened. They traveled in Hamburg in 1960. Rory famously broke the stage in Hamburg, although the stage was very rinky-dink and made of wood planks, after he had been going ham on it for days. Cracks began to form and the stage eventually fell, with him falling inside and some instruments and amps falling too. They were beaten by the doormen of the venue because of this. Ringo played for the Beatles for the first time when he was asked to sub in for Pete Best, who was shopping for drumsticks at the time, for 3 songs in a recording session. He later subbed for Pete when he was sick, and the Beatles needed a drummer for a live show. John and Paul asked Ringo to join, but he was already entertaining another offer from a band who would give him £20 a week. So they offered him 25, and he joined. The bands continued to play on the same bills as each other, which was like a little awkward. I Am the Walrus was supposed to confuse music students. I would also put English students in on here because I think that's also apt. John Lennon found out that his songs were being analyzed in universities for their meaning and for other such things. And he was like, that's so stupid. Like, I think he just didn't like that a hoity-toity university was doing such a thing. So he decided to write a completely nonsensical song to confuse everybody and to be nearly impossible to decipher, because it didn't really mean anything. So he was sending them on a wild goose chase, essentially. And this is still going on to this day, because check out this Reddit post I found where someone's trying to explain what it's about. Girly pop, who's gonna tell them? And then he mentions it in Glass Onion just to twist the knife a little and just to be like, ooh, you know, there's a lot of Beatles conspiracies and like, this song's connected and this song's connected. And it's like, don't worry about it, you know? John Lennon's like, chill. But yeah, no, it was made to confuse you. So, scrambled eggs. All my troubles seem so far away. So basically, here's the thing. Paul McCartney dreamed the original melody for Yesterday. He was worried that it was actually plagiarized subconsciously. So he literally went around to a bunch of bands and were like, da 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 da. Like, did you write that? And everyone was like, girly pop, no. And before he had the first lyric, Yesterday, he had the whole rest of the line, but there was this ba-ba-da. So instead, he had the placeholder lyric of scrambled eggs. And that's how he would sing it in the meantime, just to keep the syllable count going. Decca Records rejected the Beatles because they thought their music was too way out. They sent a demo, had an audition, coincidentally with Pete Best, there might be something to that, and were promptly rejected, which is one of the worst decisions any music label has ever made in history. Some of these are kind of nothing burgers. So, according to this Iceberg, I Want You, She's So Heavy was the last song recorded by the Beatles. I'm gonna have to fact check that because I've heard people say The End is the last Beatles song that was ever recorded. That might just be for the case of dramatic irony. But yeah, is it true? Editor Ducky will say. John Lennon was a bad student. My guy was just a general troublemaker. He had a very troubled childhood. He had a mother who he didn't meet until he was older, who later died. He was a general troublemaker. He was a bit of a nuisance for his caretaker, Aunt Mimi, and he also would frequently skip school. He would get into fights. He would fool around with girls, and he would get very bad grades. Can we pull up a John Lennon report card here? Thank you. Stuart Sutcliffe's girlfriend, Astrid Kircher, was the one who gave the Beatles their signature mop tops. And then other barbers throughout the rest of their history would continue to replicate the style. But we need to give her her flowers for what she's done. Can we put a picture of the lovely Astrid here? Yes, my queen. Mwah. It's part 2 of the Beatles Iceberg, baby. Buckle up, Buttercup, because we are gonna wrap this mother up. Detective. Did someone say the Beatles? Me having followed through on an update? Look at this character development. Speaking of character development, my Beatles fanfiction reading series is going to continue on my channel, so check that out. But today we are finally doing it, the last years of the Beatles Iceberg. Warning, this is significantly darker and significantly more inappropriate than the previous part, so viewer discretion is advised. So let's jump right into it with Year 4, baby! Uh-oh. Holy emotional whiplash, Batman. George Harrison was almost assassinated. On December 30th of 1999, George Harrison and his wife Olivia woke to the sound of breaking glass and a man breaking into their home. The attempted assassin, Michael Abram, had religious delusions that he was the Archangel Michael sent by God to kill George Harrison. Shortly before the attack, he had been released from a psychiatric hospital after he was violent with a nurse. He was later discharged from that very same hospital because they decided he was free of mental illness, which is insane and an oversight on their part, so I would consider them partially responsible, but I also suspect they did this to simply get this violent man out of their ward in particular. It is insane that this guy even managed to get into George's house, because after previous stalking incidents, and also after the murder of John Lennon, which of course made George fearful for his life, he constructed large walls around his home, had security detail, and people who worked at his house were like, this is Fort Knox, there's no way anyone's getting in here. He still managed to scale the walls and break into their home by breaking through a window. But George very bravely fought back. I actually saw an interview of George and he was like, I thought of how my son needs a father. So he really fought with all of his might and started wrestling the attacker to take away his 7-inch knife from him. George was stabbed over 40 times, including in the lung, which caused his lung to collapse. He very narrowly survived and ended up staying for 2 weeks in the hospital before being discharged, which that's kind of nuts for what he went through, so he's very strong. But his loved ones suspect that this stabbing was a reason why he wasn't able to fully recoup from his second bout of cancer. George had had a previous bout with cancer, which he was able to recover from, but his loved ones say that the devastating effect that the stabbing had on his body made him too weak to fight it again, which I'm not sure that's how that works, but they're valid. But yeah, no, if you needed another reason to think George Harrison is cool, definitely fighting a home intruder is one of them. Moving on to something lighter, Four Sides of the Eternal Triangle and After Geography. Now these are references to proposed early ideas for names for the album that would eventually become Revolver. But this isn't it. I don't know why they only put 2. There's a couple. The proposed names included Four Sides of the Eternal Triangle, which I think is cool and trippy and weird. I think it's a little too weird, especially that early in their career. After Geography, Magical Circles, my favorite, Beatles on Safari, and Pendulum, all of which are pretty goofy and not incredible and also kind of long, kind of try hard. Revolver is nice and clean, it's one word, and in Beatles fashion, it's a pun, but it doesn't matter that it's a pun. It's like the Beatles name, it's technically a pun, but no one cares because that doesn't matter because the name is so ubiquitous that they don't need to be clever. It really functions by itself as a title, but it not only references a handgun, a revolver, but it's also a play on the format of the vinyl record itself, which revolves as it plays. Yep, the Beatles, masters of humor. Moving from one unused album name to another, A Doll's House was the original title given to what would later become the White Album. It was named after the Ibsen play of the same name. This image here, which you will normally see in connection with A Doll's House, was not actually the album cover. The album cover was always going to be white in order to contrast from the previous Sgt. Pepper's cover, which was so busy. It was like, we're gonna make it flat. It's just gonna say our name on it. It was considered, but then they were like, the white, it's cool. And they were right. They were 100% right. The reason why they didn't use this name is because it was already taken by a band called Family. So they simply chose to call it The Beatles. So it was their self-titled album, but now it is largely popularly called The White Album. So this next one is about the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, and I'm realizing that last video, I forgot a crucial detail in the Paul is Dead theory. So if you look here at the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, and if we look a little closer, do you see these wax figures that are standing behind the Beatles? See, one of them looks real sad, and it's Ringo, and they're comforting him. What is he looking down at? He is looking down at a patch of flowers that is shaped like a left-handed guitar. Paul McCartney is left-handed. So generally, one of the pieces of evidence is this is Ringo looking down at Paul's grave, which is right there on the cover. I don't believe it, but I'm like, why would you make a wax figure of that? Doesn't make any sense. Anyway, this album cover, of course, is one of the most famous of all time. So much so that the same photographer and the same style was used and ripped off by the Rolling Stones for their very mediocre album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. See, when you do satanic stuff, things don't come out well. As you can see, there are many life-size cutouts of figures such as Marilyn Monroe, Edgar Allan Poe, among others. Now, John Lennon was feeling like an edgy edgelord. He proposed a couple figures who did not make the cut. John Lennon originally wanted to put Hitler and Jesus, which I don't even like saying in the same sentence, on the Sgt. Pepper's album cover. But both of these purported figures were controversial in their own way. Hitler, because of Hitler, and in regard to Jesus, they were like, hey, don't put Jesus, people are gonna get mad because you said some pretty not nice stuff about Jesus just a couple months ago. But fun fact, a Jesus cutout never made it to the photo shoot, but a Hitler cutout did make it to the photo shoot. But it was hidden in the back while they were taking the picture. They're like, no. They're like, we can't get rid of this thing, but we're just gonna hide it behind everything else so no one knows it's there. But from certain different angles of the photo shoot, which by the way are just really cool to look at in general, you can see it, which is troubling. The Penny Lane vandalization. So obviously in Liverpool on Penny Lane, there was a sign to commemorate the fact that it's like, it's the thing from the song, you guys. Like, there's a lot of Beatles tourism, and that's an included part. And this commemorative sign itself was actually vandalized. And this was due to the allegation that the street itself was named after James Penny, who was a slave owner and trader. Now, this can be contested because it's like penny is also a word, so that could be used. It doesn't necessarily need to be named after him. However, Liverpool was an epicenter for the slave trade. There is debate whether it should be kept up to preserve both Beatles and national history, or whether it should be changed to avoid glorifying a slave owner. Don't know why all these album names are super far down, but Everest is another one. So Abbey Road was originally going to be called Everest. The only problem was that if they called it Everest, the Beatles would want to do, obviously, a photo shoot on Mount Everest. But that's a big ask, and they just ended up not being able to do it. So they ended up naming their album after the shooting location they did end up going with, which was obviously Abbey Road, which was outside of their studio. It was very impromptu. They just like walk across the street, they're like, this is gonna look sick. And then they ended up making like the most iconic album cover of all time, somehow. I like to think that they would have named their album after Anywhere. They took the picture, it's like somehow we'd end up with a Beatles album called Paul's Living Room. Paul McCartney, Michael Jackson. Maybe seems unlikely. I'd argue not. They were both the biggest pop stars of their time, and their friendship was extremely profitable in the 80s. They made the very cheesy "The Girl Is Mine" and "Say, Say, Say." Paul used his experience, wisdom, everything he learned, both what to do and what not to do from his career in the Beatles, to advise Michael, both in his career, in his investments, in his record contracts. Much like the Beatles, where they had a previously very friendly manager, very personable manager, and then later had one who had more business interests, Michael was definitely surrounded by people who wanted to exploit him left and right. So having a friend like Paul McCartney, who is experienced and also was looking out for him, invaluable. Very important. This was until Michael Jackson bought the Beatles' entire discography, which included some of Paul McCartney's music, and this created a rift, and their public relationship at the very least was severed. Don't Pass Me By was written in 1962. Pretty explanatory, not gonna lie. Don't Pass Me By was indeed written in 1962 by Ringo Starr. He said he wrote it when he was just banging away at the keyboard. In true Ringo fashion, it was put up right on the refrigerator and stayed there until 1968. Thankfully, it was released for us all to love. I always love a Ringo song. Stream Goodnight, everybody. That's a great song also. Also, Boys. Boys is one of my favorite Beatles songs. It's classic rockabilly, it's classic skiffle, and it's just Ringo going off and singing really well because he has a nice voice. He has a nice voice just for Ringo. Justice for Ringo. The Beatles insulted Imelda Marcos, so this is a little misleading. Hey, Iceberg, you're spreading the same misinformation the Beatles were actively combating at the time of this controversy. Ooh, not a good look. In 1966, the Beatles went to the Philippines, where they performed 2 big concerts. The Beatles were then subsequently invited to the presidential palace to visit the Philippines president, as well as his wife, Imelda Marcos. Brian Epstein declined their offer because he just had a general policy. It's like the Beatles aren't going to be accepting any formal invitations. This was just a catch-all policy. So they left Imelda, as well as 300 children of high-ranking officials who she had invited as guests, waiting. Never came. The press was going really hard on the Beatles, saying that they purposefully slighted and snubbed their first lady. So a lot of people got really mad at the Beatles. Brian Epstein literally had to go on TV to make a statement to clarify what happened. But, and I can't even make this up, The broadcast of his public clarification was interrupted by TV static. So everyone was just more confused and it just got worse. While they were leaving, it was a mess at the airports, and Mal Evans, their road manager, was beaten up by an angry mob. And guess what? After this huge controversy, the next month, the Bigger Than Jesus thing happened. Oh my gosh. This is a political cartoon that someone made about it. Tier 5, tier 5, tier 5, tier 5. Tier 5. On George cameo in a movie, yay! George was a huge Monty Python fan and later became friends with Monty Python, essentially frontman, Eric Idle. During his sort of film producing era, that was something he was into for a little bit. George funded the film Life of Brian by mortgaging his house. And I think he knew he wasn't the greatest actor in the whole wide world, but he still wanted to be in the film, and so he ended up being a background extra. It's fascinating because going into this, you would never think George has all the deep lore, but you'd be so wrong. George's birthday, the most controversial of Beatles' birthdays. For most of George's life, he believed that his birthday was February 25th, and all was well. But later in his life, it was discovered that his birth certificate and hospital records said 2 different dates. There had been an error, and George's birthday was actually on February 24th. So actually, psych April Fools, George made all of that up. He wasn't even born in a hospital. He was born in his house. He was indeed born on the 25th, and he just felt like messing with everybody because people call him the Quiet Beatle, but George was a trickster, a deviant, and he wasn't. But I'd argue George was actually the funniest Beatle. So after hearing all of this about John Lennon, you might be shocked that he was a scout and a choir boy growing up. Although he's broadly known as the troublemaker, which continued from his youth into his career onward, you know, especially him making songs like How Do You Sleep about Paul, like that feud was crazy. He grew up as a member of St. Peter's Church Choir and was a member of the Allerton Scout Troop, which is alleged by the scouting organization to be where John and Paul met. But that's them saying that, so I don't really buy it. SNL offered the Beatles $3,000 of obviously that time's money to reunite and play on SNL. On air, during the show, Lorne Michaels, mostly joking, offered the Beatles $3,000 to reunite and play on SNL. Funny thing is, John and Paul were at John's apartment and were watching SNL together at the time and briefly genuinely considered it. Paul said the reason that he refused was because he was tired. But George was later a musical guest on SNL, and Paul McCartney very recently played at SNL 50 playing a really amazing medley. It was like so beautiful. Tier 6, tier 6, tier 6, tier 6. It's tier 6, my pretties. Ringo's childhood. All the Beatles had a tough childhood in one way or another. John Lennon's mom died, Paul McCartney's mom died. Lots of things were going on, but Ringo had a particularly uniquely troubled upbringing. He was poor. His parents got divorced when he was young, and he had multiple diseases growing up, including tuberculosis and appendicitis, and this led to him being somewhat of a hypochondriac later in life and not always being keen on shaking hands because he is more susceptible to getting sick and would get sick during the Beatles' career. Due to all of his time spent in the hospital, he missed a lot of school, and he was illiterate even up until the age of 8. And in the hospital, Ringo would be introduced to percussion instruments, which was one of the only things he had to do to pass the time. This is how Ringo fell in love with percussion and ended up being the best, hottest, most in-demand drummer in Liverpool. John Lennon almost killed a man. Bob Wooler was a well-known manager in Liverpool during the time of the Beatles. He was also a resident DJ at the Top 10 Club in Liverpool, but Bob finally met the Beatles as the owner of the Cavern Club, where the Beatles would famously get their start. At Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party, John Lennon was asked by Bob Wooler how he enjoyed his honeymoon with Brian Epstein, which is a reference to the 1963 vacation that John Lennon and Brian Epstein took privately in Barcelona, which has been a point of speculation, but I think that's unfair. I think that's none of our business. Let's not be weird. Furious at the implication of being seen as gay, John began to brutally beat up Bob Wooler, leaving him unconscious, bloody, and bruised. John recalls stopping and thinking to himself that if he continued beating this man, he could kill him. So it's not he was going to kill somebody, but he realized that he had that capability. After a while and settling down, he was able to send a telegram to Bob Wooler saying he was sorry. This was a big wake-up call for John Lennon, where he suddenly became aware of what his anger could do and what he's truly capable of. According to his wife Cynthia, he vowed that he would never do such a thing again. And according to Cynthia, he didn't. Whether that means being violent in general or almost killing somebody is up to speculation. It was a pretty vague statement. Paul McCartney witnessed 9/11, and he also did so in a very unique way. Paul McCartney was in a grounded plane at the JFK airport awaiting the takeoff when he witnessed the 9/11 attacks out of his window. Of course, as a result of this, he was stuck in the plane for a long time and stranded in New York City, I'm sure even longer. But he made it out safe and sound. But obviously, very mentally impacted. Moved by this experience and also harnessing the influence he has as Paul McCartney, one of the Beatles, he helped to organize the Concert for New York City, which was a benefit concert that happened in the wake of 9/11. Paul also later wrote the song Freedom about the tragedy. Another fun John fact, John liked to sleep in a coffin. Okay, Goth GF. Okay, Ebony Darkness Dementio Ravenway. Be careful, we gotta baby-proof that edge. You might get hurt. In 1957, John Lennon enrolled in art school. And while there was a coffee bar that he was known to frequent that was run by Alan Williams, who was his manager at the time. In that coffee bar, for some dang reason, was an old abandoned coffin in which John Lennon liked taking naps for some reason. So it wasn't like he was sleeping in it, it wasn't like it was in his house, but like, that's so eerie. Final tear. We did it. I'm gonna miss you guys. Final tear. But it's not the final tear in my eye. I love whoever made this iceberg, but what a nothing burger to put in the last tier. In 1972 and 1973, Pink Floyd used Abbey Road Studios to record their debut album, primarily utilizing Studios 2 and 3. All of the editing equipment at the Beatles' disposal during their extremely experimental years was at theirs. They used much of the editing equipment in Room 4 in order to create the cross-fading effects that are seen on Us and Them and Money. Another very sad entry, John Lennon's last photo. The last known photo of John Lennon, taken on the day of his assassination on December 8th of 1980, is famous not only because it's the last, but because of a horrifying detail. If you look in the background of the image, you can see John Lennon's assassin, Mark David Chapman. Not only was he there, but he got his copy of Double Fantasy signed by the man who he would later murder on the front steps of his apartment building that day. Truly terrifying. I wanted to make sure this last entry was juicy, so we're talking about Jimmy Nicol, everybody. Who's Jimmy Nicol? Great question. Jimmy Nicol was a Beatle for a week. At the very height of their popularity, Jimmy Nicol sat in for Ringo as the Beatles drummer for 8 concerts because Ringo Starr was out with tonsillitis. Despite him briefly being in the most famous band in the whole world for a time, he fell immediately into obscurity after the fact, as soon as Ringo came back. Unlike someone like Pete Best, who tried to stay relevant through their connection with the Beatles, Jimmy did quite the opposite. He laid low. He moved to Mexico. He played with other bands and then turned to entrepreneurship. Most of the Beatles accepted him as a temporary replacement, but George, being a real one, threatened to not go on tour at all. Being like, if you can replace Ringo, then you can replace me. George was mad that they would replace Ringo for any period of time as opposed to simply canceling the dates. Ringo Starr is quoted as saying, "It was very strange them going off without me. They'd taken Jimmy Nicol and I thought they didn't love me anymore. All that stuff went through my head." That's so sad. That's so sad. He took it so personally. But Jimmy played with the band anyway, the rest of the band intact. He was given a mop top for these 8 nights to match everyone else and actually wore Ringo's suit, which is like pathological. Like that, I'd be upset about that too. Nicol is quoted as saying, "The day before I was a Beatle, girls weren't interested in me at all. The day after, with the suit and the Beatle cut, riding in the back of the limo with John and Paul, they were dying to get a touch of me. It was very strange and quite scary." Nicol also details a time that him and John Lennon went to a brothel together. Generally, Nicol was a very good source to talk about the Beatles' truly debaucherous side. For his time, he was paid £500, which today comes out to $12,798. He got to be a Beatle for a while, but now is largely forgotten. So let's remember him. This is also good Beatles trivia to impress your friends. As Nicol said, "Until then, I was quite happy earning £30 or £40 a week. After the headlines died, I began dying too. After the money ran low, I thought of cashing in some way or another, but the time wasn't right. And I didn't want to step on the Beatles' toes. They had been damn good for me and to me." I like him. He has integrity. He's like the anti-Pete Best. I can't believe it's over. That was the Beatles' Iceberg, everybody. All 7 tiers? That was so fun. Thank you for being so patient and waiting for my follow-up. I really hope you enjoyed it. I really hope you learned something new. I hope you were entertained. If you would like to suggest any other icebergs you'd like me to do, please comment them down below. I gladly will. I have loved this iceberg for years. And I want to thank you all so much for your support, your love, your comments, your likes, your views, and just for being here. It really means a lot to me. Comment down below if you have any other really obscure Beatles facts, because I always want to learn more. God bless and have an amazing day. I've been Ducky and you've been lovely. Goodbye. Mwah.